Today's video, we're going to cover a technique for avoiding clipping the camera when navigating through spaces. A lot of RayTK scenes involve grids or tunnels or other types of repeating shapes in three-dimensional space. And when you're doing that, you'll often end up with cases where the camera goes through a surface and things black out until it passes all the way through. For this video, we're going to skip over downloading the toolkit and the initial setup. If you don't know how to do that, I recommend checking out the first video in the intro series or any of the full scene tutorials. They tend to cover that at the beginning. After you've loaded RayTK in your project, open the palette with the Alt-R shortcut and create a RayMarch Render 3D. And then we're going to create a null top connected to the first output so you can see the rendered image. With the renderer selected, open RayTK's Editor Tools menu with Alt-Shift-R. And then under Add Camera, we're going to choose Look at Camera. Next, we'll add an STF to define some shapes for the scene for testing. Let's open the palette again with Alt-R, and we're going to create a lattice STF. And then connect that up to the first input on the renderer. This gives us a three-dimensional grid with different options for changing how the bars are arranged. Using that shape parameter, you can see how it gets different arrangements of bars kind of in a repeating grid. But already with that, we're seeing some places where things black out where it intersects a camera. So let's leave that back down at 0 for the shape. And we're just going to stick with this as an example. We're going to try one more SDF later at the end, but this technique applies to all sorts of different scenes like this. There are two main ways to move it through a scene. So you can either move the camera or you can move the contents of the scene. Personally, I tend to go for moving the scene rather than the camera, but that's just my own preference. So we're going to start with that approach, but at the end, we're going to discuss how to apply the same technique when removing the camera instead. So let's create a translate operator, and we're going to insert that between the lattice and the renderer. And then on that, for the translate parameter for Z, you can try moving that, and that's going to cause that whole grid to move forwards or backwards. So with this operator selected, let's open the Editor Tools menu again with Alt-Shift-R. And then under Animate with Speed, we're going to go under Translate, and we're just going to do the Z part. And then on the speed generator here, let's increase that speed up to maybe 1. So that gives us some nice continuous motion. If your scene was using a modular 3D or something, you could kind of do this with the shift parameter instead. This is great as it is, but what happens if we move the camera up a little bit? So let's go over to our camera, and then for the Y part of the position, just move that up to 1. And suddenly we start getting camera intersections. So ideally, the best option is to keep the camera away from any surfaces and make sure it's always, in a clear path. But while that might be simple for just a basic grid like this, things can get way more complicated if you have noise-based distortion or other types of more complicated contents in your scene. So now we're getting to the main point of the video. So the technique here is to use a sphere to cut out a bubble around the camera so that it never intersects with anything. So let's create a sphere SDF. And then we're going to create a combine and connect the translate to the first input on the combine and the sphere to the second input. Just move that out of the way there. And then connect the combine to the renderer. So now we're seeing the sphere in the scene, but that's not what we want. So there's two issues here. One is that the sphere is in the wrong place. It's not on top of the camera, it's in front of it. And also we're actually seeing it. It's not being subtracted from the scene. It's just being added to it. So let's fix the first one by going over to our camera, and we're going to right click on this position parameter, choose copy parameter, and then we're going to go over to our sphere SDF, and then on its translate parameter, you're going to right click that and choose paste reference. So now everything goes black, which in this case is actually what we want, because that means that the sphere is now sitting directly on top of the camera. So the next part is to have it subtracted from the scene instead of added to it. So let's go over to our combine, and then we can change the combine mode from simple union to simple difference. And now we can see how things get cut off when they get really close to the camera, but it doesn't totally block the view. So then we can go over to our sphere and increase that radius up to something like 1. And now we get a wider area. We can even bump it up higher, maybe up to 2 or something. So now things get kind of cut off as they approach the camera, so we make sure that we never actually hit it. You can also change how that gets cut off. So right now it's doing just kind of a hard cut, like just a flat cutoff where it intersects that sphere. But on the combine, we can change our mode from simple difference to smooth difference. And then that gives us this blend radius parameter. So we can change how it blends out. So there it's kind of tapering off rather than just suddenly getting cut off when it gets too close. So on the camera, let's just increase our view angle. So we're going to increase the FOV angle up to something pretty high, like maybe 100. That gives us a wider view. And things are getting kind of distorted in the background there, but that's sort of a topic for another tutorial. But the general idea is that as things get close within that range of the camera, they get kind of cut off, and that getting cut off happens with a smooth taper rather than just a hard cut. And that's basically it. But we had mentioned earlier that we were going to talk about when you are moving the camera instead of moving the contents of the scene. So to do that, let's go back over to our translate, and we're just going to switch off the enable parameter there. So the grid is going to stay where it is, and the camera, we're going to get that moving. So let's go over to our camera, and we can try changing the Z part of the position, so moving that. But you're going to notice that as it gets really close to the center, it's dipping down. That's because this is a look at camera, so it's always trying to look at that point at the center or wherever we put it, but currently it's set to 0, 0, 0. So as we pass over it, it starts looking downwards, and when you get right on top of it, things totally black out because the camera gets really confused. So what we want to do is move the camera without having it change what direction it's facing. So one option there could be to change that look at position along with the regular position, but there's an easier way that was added recently, which is called a camera transform. So let's open the palette and create a camera transform. And then we're going to insert that between the camera and the renderer. This is sort of filling in a gap where regular transform operators don't work the way that one might expect on cameras. So there's this special transform that's just intended for working with cameras. So it has a setting about whether it should adjust the look at position along with the position itself. Now we can change the position translate, the Z part, and it's going to move that look at position along with the camera's position, so it's not going to change the angle that it's facing. But we are seeing an issue where it is intersecting. So what is going on there? So the issue there is that we are having that bubble that's cut out of the scene stuck at the position of 0, 1, and wherever 2, wherever you have that set to. but that's not taking into account this transform that's being applied to it. So what we need to do is update the position of that sphere to take into account what this camera transform is doing to change the position of the camera. So let's go to the camera transform and then expand the position translate parameter. We're going to right click just the Z part of it and choose copy parameter. Then we're going to go over to our sphere, and then on the translate parameter, we're going to expand that. And then for just the Z part, we're going to right click that and choose paste reference. So that puts in this new expression here that's using the parameter from this operator instead. But what we actually want is to have both. So to do that, let's make a little edit to the expression here. So we're going to take the expression from the X part, that's just grabbing the parameter directly from the look at camera. Then we're going to go over to the Z part, and then at the end, we're going to add a plus, and then paste in that other expression, and then replace the X at the end with a Z. And then we can do the same thing for the other two axes, so we can copy this whole thing, paste it in for Y, make sure that we change both that one there, and then for the other parameter there. And then we're going to do the same thing for X, so just replacing both of those Z's with X's instead. Now we can go over to our camera transform and we can move that however we want, and it's always going to have the bubble following wherever the camera is. And you can move it on different axes if you want, however you want, and it's always going to stay on top of the camera. So let's add some animation to that. Then we can go over to our camera transform with that selected, open the editor tools menu with Alt-Shift-R. And under animate with speed, we can go to the position translate and just the Z part. You could do the other parts too if you want, but I'm just going to do the Z. And now we can make some adjustments on our speed generator, like moving that first part of the speed up to maybe 2, and then swapping the reverse here so it's coming towards the camera instead of away from it. So now, whatever movement that we have on the camera there, we're always going to make sure that there is a chunk of the scene that's being cut out right around it, and it's going to follow it wherever it goes. This technique works well for lots of different situations where you have a camera moving around in an area that has a lot of stuff in it, or if you have a lot of stuff moving around that might hit the camera. So let's just try one more type of SDF. So open the palette with Alt-R, and then we're going to type gyroid SDF, and then we're going to connect this instead of the lattice. And you can do it directly to combine if you want, but since we're not using that translate, it doesn't really matter. So this SDF is one that fills all of space with this kind of repeating pattern based on sine waves. But without an approach like this, lattice SDF is really hard to use because it always fills all space. So it's really likely that you're going to end up having it hit the camera. So using a technique like this allows us to take out enough of it that we can view some area. And if you want to make that a larger area, you can go over to your sphere and increase the radius there, and that's going to make the bubble larger. So it's going to get cut off further away from the camera. And that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching. I hope this was helpful. And if there are any other techniques that you are interested in, or types of situations that you keep encountering when you're developing with RayTK, reach out and let me know either in the comments here or via Instagram or Discord. And there are links for that stuff in the video description. If you want to support RayTK development, check out my Patreon. You'll get early access to tutorials, exclusive scene downloads, and more. Thanks for watching, and as always, make sure to like and subscribe.